Welcome to the lecture on transitional environments. It is the sixth lecture on sedimentary environments. This is your teacher, Dr. Sandra Catane. Last meeting, we discussed about deltaic environments, and it is one of the depositional environments classified as transitional. But today, we will discuss another transitional environment which has a lot of similarity with deltas, especially in their tectonic setting, except for the major ocean processes influencing their formation and distribution. Last meeting, we discussed about deltaic environments, one of the depositional environments classified as transitional. Today, we are going to discuss another transitional environment which has a lot of similarity with deltas, except for the major process influencing their formation and distribution. I am referring to peritidal environments which are characterized by coastlines that do not carry large amount of sediments and thus do not form delta. Instead, we have system of coastal lagoons, estuaries, bays, and tidal flats where the dominant influence is the rise and fall of tides or working effects of tides. They are normally marshy, especially when they're submerged during high tide, and exposed or emergent during low tides. These are areas, or we call them a stress environment, dominated by few organisms that can tolerate extreme ranges in salinity. Since the water is reducing, muds are often black in color, contain a lot of unoxidized organic matter. An important factor for the formation of tidal flats includes wide range of wide tidal range. It has to be like more than 4 meters. Absence of strong wave actions. Therefore, these areas are tide dominated. These muds are often alternating with fine silt and sand layers from tidal channel flooding. Bedding could be slightly undulatory due to this disturbance by plant. In extreme cases, bedding is completely destroyed by bioturbation. This is a lagoon, which is a coastal body with limited connection to the open ocean. If a lagoon is fed by a river, then it is considered as part of the estuary system. The estuary, which is the mouth of the river, is the widened tidal mouth of a river valley where fresh water comes out into contact with seawater and where tidal effects are evident. Tidal flats are extensive, nearly horizontal, marshy or barren tract of land, covered or uncovered by tide. It consists of unconsolidated sediment, mostly mud and sand that sometimes form the top surface of deltaic deposits. This is a photo showing some tidal flats. And this diagram shows a photo of a lagoon, baymouth bar, this barrier here, and a tidal inlet where water enters the lagoon during high tide. The upper reaches of tidal flats are subaerially exposed like this, except during unusual high tides. They have many subaerial features such as mud cracks, algal mats. They also harbor oysters and other organisms that cannot tolerate the strong flow of the lower tidal flats. The upper tidal flat muds are often heavily bioturbated. Note that when strong flow is rather, a tidal flow is strong, vegetation is prevented from being established. When completely exposed, all the effects of receding tide waters can be seen in the exposed sedimentary structures. Though during tidal runoff, they may be washed out or rounded. Tidal flats are unique among sedimentary environments in that they experience a daily cycle of reversing flow directions and exposures, as indicated in this figure. So we have, this is the time, and we have here low water, and then high water, and then low water again as the tides recedes, and corresponding deposit would be the sand and silt or clay, and then sand again. This part of the diagram shows the bottom current velocity in centimeters per second, and this is the water depth. So you get normally sediments that are interbedded sand and mud within a day. So this represents the first tide, and this is the second tide. So basically, the tidal process produces a regular cycle of mud and sand deposition. At low water and high water, there is relatively little flow and finer materials settle out. During advancing and receding of tides, the currents move across the mud flats, producing cross-bedded sands between muds. Reversing directions can also produce herringbone crossbeds, which is unique to tidal environments. Ribs on a herring or other fish, that's how the name came about. Herringbone results from tidal currents flowing predominantly in one direction for a period of time, followed by a change in the pattern of tidal flow that results in another period of opposite flow. Take note that this is not due to diurnal pattern, which would imply very high rates of sedimentation. This is another example of a herringbone structure indicating bimodal history. Tidal crossbeds often show reactivation of surfaces because retreating tides carve back the crossbeds that are built during the advance, only to have the next tidal surge rebuild the crossbeds over reactivation surfaces. When completely exposed, all the effects of the receding tide waters can be seen in exposed sedimentary structure, although during runoff, these structures can be washed out or rounded like this. Another characteristic sedimentary feature of tidal flats is the flasur, wavy, and lenticular bedding. The difference in current strength between the tidal cycles separates the muddy from sandy fraction. Ripples formed by higher velocity currents accumulate mud in their troughs. The mud is scarred out, but the receding tides and flasur beds form. As the abundance of mud increases, wavy bedding and eventually lenticular bedding results. When you say lenticular bedding, sand is sand in mud matrix. Wavy bedding, sand and mud is 50-50%. Flasur bedding, sand predominates over mud. So basically, for lenticular, it is the mud that predominates over sand. The energy is highest in flasur, followed by wavy bedding, and last is lenticular, which has the lowest energy. This is an exposure of, what do you think? Which one predominates? I think we all agree that this is a lenticular bedding. How about this one? Do we see sub-equal amounts or percentage? We can regard this as wavy bedding. And the third one is, I think you bet it right, it's a flusser. This is a summary of the three types of beds that are typical for tidal deposits. Lenticular beds are lenses of sand with predominant matrix of muddy beds. We have wavy beds, sub-equal amounts of sand and mud. And here we have predominantly stacks of small lenses of sand, which is less than 50% muddy matrix. Diagnostic features of peritidal environments. They are normally occurring at passive tectonic margins with the broad, shallow coastal regions. In terms of geometry, they are tabular in shape. However, they can have local sand bodies few meters in thickness, which is parallel to the shoreline. Typical sequence, we have finding upward sequence of herringbone cross-bedded sands. Sedimentology, very diagnostic feature, herringbone cross-bedding, flusser, lenticular bedding, and reactivation surfaces. Abundant bioturbation in terms of fossils. Normally, the upper tidal flat muds show extensive bioturbation. Barrier island complexes. This is the next topic, next environment in the transitional sedimentary environment. Another transitional environment that is associated with peritidal environments are barrier complexes, which are basically elongate sandy island or peninsulas that parallel the shoreline and are separated from it by lagoons, marshes, and other features. They are formed on coastlines where there is an abundant supply of sediments and where tidal range is small enough that longshore currents and wave action are more important than the tidal currents. This here in the figure is an barrier island complex. Dunes can be formed at the surface. Washover is formed by swashing by strong waves. Tidal channel with ebb tides delta. Main tidal inlet, flood tidal delta. These are features that are formed in or adjacent to barrier complexes. You have marsh here, you have secondary tidal channel here as well, and this is tidal flat. Barrier islands can be created by different processes. First is longshore currents carry sediments parallel to the shore, forming a sandpit that increases in length with time. A large storm events may breach, split, and create a new tidal inlet in the sandspit, which may cause the sandspit to break away from the mainland. When this occurs, a barrier island forms. Next is when rate of sea level rise may cause inundation of Aeolian beach dunes. The dunes form the base of a new island, new barrier island. It could be also a submerged offshore bar deposited by wave action that emerge to form a barrier island. And the fourth way to produce barrier islands is when an abandoned delta form or lead to the formation of a barrier island. In this slide, the barrier island complex can be separated into distinct sub-environments. The main barrier separates the shore face region from the back barrier lagoons and tidal flats. Along the shore face is a series of features that are caused by wave action and variation in tide levels. This is the shore face. The shore face begins where the wave base first begins to meet the bottom at depths around 10 to 20 meters depending on the size of the waves. In the lower shore face, there is a weak wave effect, fine sand intercalated with layers of mud, planar lamination, although bioturbation can obliterate the structures. In the middle shore face, this part, is strongly influenced by shoaling and breaking of waves. Medium-grained sand that is well sorted with a lot of broken shell layers, longshore bars, are found. The middle shore face is less strongly bioturbated than the lower shore face, although extensive biogenic debris and activity are common. In the upper shore face, which is the surf zone, it is affected by plunging waves and wave-driven longshore current. Sedimentary structures of the shore face reflect varying flow directions with multi-directional trough crossbeds and interpairs with low-angle planar crossbeds and subhorizontal plane beds. The shore face is particularly susceptible to erosion during strong waves in major storms. Therefore, they are very rarely preserved in the geologic record. Next slide, the most dominant feature in a swash zone is gently laminated planar crossbeds that dip shallowly seaward, roughly about 2 to 10 degrees, and are broadly lenticular. Foreshore sands tend to be coarser than those found in the offshore. Because the wave energy is greater, they are also well sorted due to extensive reworking by swash and backwash. Extensive reworking often concentrate minerals of density, so beach sands may have well-developed laminae of heavy minerals. Backshore, the top of the foreshore is marked by a sandy terrace known as berms whose crests are above high water level. Berms are formed during unusually high storm waves and remains there until the next big storm. In this environment, wind is more important than waves in redistributing the sediments. A barrier dune crossbed differs from desert dunes in that they are smaller in scale and limited in linear distribution. They also tend to be abundantly borrowed by marine crustaceans. This slide shows a barrier island. During storms, dune crest may be rebreached by waves that overtop barrier deposits. Lobes or sheets of sand into the lagoon that is usually dominated by fine-grained deposits. where the washover sand, okay, these are extensive washover sand, enters the lagoon, it is normally dominated by finer sediments. Sometimes they form as a small delta, small scale delta forsets. Washover sands are generally fine to medium grained sand and are not well sorted, similar to beach or sand dune sands. This is a spit made up of sand and gravel projecting from the shore into the body of water. A spit is attached to the mainland basically, but once it is separates, it becomes a barrier island. Behind the barrier is the region of lagoon, tidal flats, in which quiet waters allows fine silt and clays to settle out of suspension. There is an abrupt shift from coarse to clean, well-sorted sands of the backshore dunes to the finely laminated clays in the lagoon. Lagunal waters can become stagnant and anaerobic, forming black organic rich muds, coal and peat swamps. They can be hypersaline as well to allow the deposition of evaporites. Unlike ordinary tidal flats, the area behind barrier islands is often punctuated by sands that show the effects of nearby barrier and the storms that breach it. This is a typical sequence of regression setting. In a regression setting, coarse sediments of dune overlies the sediments of the shore face area. These are characteristic features of siliciclastic tidal flats. Here are the deposits, sediment types, and detailed characteristics of its. Please do your reading. Diagnostic features of beach barrier environments in terms of tectonic setting. They are closely associated with peritidal and deltaic sequences. Geometry is elongate shoestring sands with marine shell sequences. Typical sequence, you expect a coarsening upward sequence or progradation. To continue, in terms of sedimentology, they are composed of mineralogically mature quartz mixed with occasional heavy minerals. In terms of fossils, they are diverse, from shelly invertebrate fauna and merry burrowing invertebrates. Lagoons, you can have plants and mudflats dwelling animals like stenohaline. That ends the lecture on Transitional Environments Part 2. Thank you for listening.